Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
December 2nd, 1642. An abundance of excellent timber and a gently sloping watercourse in a barren valley. They had seen 2 trees about 2 or 2.5 fathoms, 4 metres, in thickness, measuring from 60 to 65 feet from the ground to the lowermost branches. That on the ground they had observed certain footprints of animals, not unlike those of a tiger's claws. They also brought on board a small quantity of gum of a seemingly very fine quality, which had exuded from the trees. They reported that the land is pretty generally covered with trees, standing so far apart that they allow a passage everywhere, and a lookout to a great distance, so that when landing, our men could always get sight of natives or wild beasts unhindered by dense shrubbery or underwood. In the interior, they had in several places observed numerous trees which had deep holes burnt into them, the surrounding soil having become as hard as flint through the action of the fire. We now and then saw clouds of dense smoke rising up from the land. This is a quote from Abel Jansoon Tasman's journal of the discovery of Van Diemen's Land in New Zealand in 1642. It's the first description of sclerophyll forests written in the English language. The giant trees he describes were probably mesmate, which is a large species of eucalyptus that grows on the east coast of Tasmania. This crew probably landed at Frederick Hendrick Bay, an area with wet and dry sclerophyll forests. The word sclerophyll comes from the Greek sclero, meaning hard, and phyllon, meaning leaf. So sclerophyll plants have really special adaptations to deal with the low rainfall and the shortage of nutrients that we have here in Australia, if you're not sick of hearing that phrase yet. Sclerophyll plants are characterised by having hard, short, often spiky leaves, which is a condition closely associated with low soil fertility. So it's really well adapted to this climate. When it's so hard to say this word. When sclerophyllous eucalypts form forests, they can either be classified as wet or dry sclerophyllous forests. Got it that time. Sclerophyllous forests, as hard as it is to say, or maybe it's just me, occupy a really special place in the heart of what it is to be in Australia. So when you think about these sorts of forests, they're actually what we often characterise as the Australian bush. Sclerophyllous, oh my god, I can't even say it now. Sclerophyllous forests are the backyard for millions of people, and they represent a really quintessential Australian environment. When we talk about So when we talk about sclerophyllous plants, we're talking about eucalypts, banksias, and acacias. And they are really dominant in the Australian landscape. With eucalypts, right, there's over 700 species across Australia. And these are the things that really dominate sclerophyllous forests. So I wanted to take you out and, give you a look at a eucalypt up close and personal to see what really makes it so special for the Australian environment.
So everyone, the next thing I want to show you is how Australian plants, particularly eucalypts, have so well adapted to our environment and how much sunlight and heat we have here. But I'm having massive problems finding a eucalyptus tree around where I live. Searching. Finally found one! Woo! So sclerophyll forests are a really unique Australian environment that's often associated with poor soil fertility. So these are usually dominated by things like eucalypts, banksias and acacias, and things with short leaves, spiky leaves, leaves that are really good at saving water and resisting heat. And that makes them perfectly adapted to the Australian environment. Now, you can find these sorts of plants in most places in Australia, and I finally have found an example. So let's hop out of the car and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so here I am at the back of Milton. Now, what I brought along with me is some leaves off that beautiful giant fig tree that I showed you, which is not a tree that you'd find in a sclerophyll environment, and a nice leaf that's seen a little bit better days out of a houseplant I have at home. So you can see with these guys, really green, okay? They have really broad surface area, so they're soaking up a lot of sunlight, and they're nice and soft, really malleable, okay? So that just means that they're prone to desiccation, so they can get dried out really quickly, and also they soak up a lot of heat, okay? Because there's a lot of that facing the sun. Now, compare that to leaves off my little tree friend behind me of a eucalypt. So this is part of a branch, and don't worry, I got it off the ground. I did not damage the tree. A few things. You can see that it faces downward. Now this is so it can avoid midday sun, okay? So if you're hanging down, then when the sun's directly above, it's very hard to soak up too much heat. Now the other thing we'll notice is compared to those green leaves, it's got a really small surface area, okay? We're not very broad here. It's facing downwards, so you would think at any one time, not a whole lot of sunlight's going to be hitting that leaf. And if you think about midday sun, it's going to be this part of the leaf that's getting it, right? So we've got downward facing leaves. We've got... What was I saying? This is so much harder than it looks, people. Okay, we've got downward facing leaves. We've got narrow leaves out of the midday sun. Now the other thing is they are smaller leaves than a lot of greener plants would have and trees. So unlike the fig tree and that other house plant that I showed you, the leaves are relatively much smaller. And the other little characteristic is they are pale in colour. And what's that going to do? It's going to reflect sunlight. So compared to those darker green, broader leaves, gum leaves are much better at avoiding soaking up too much heat and too much sunlight. And that's really important when you live in the hottest, driest place in the world. So eucalypts and other Australian plants adapted to our environment are much higher in woody tissues and fibrous materials than other plants. So that means they can survive for longer, and they use less water because they're not having to replenish their leaves as often. They can survive on less. That makes them really hearty and very well adapted for our environment. Now, eucalypts can also even expand and contract their crown in response to water availability. So they can shrink their crown if there's not a lot of water, and they can expand it if they have the resources to do so. All of these things make eucalyptus pretty nifty.
Hopefully what you got from those videos, apart from gathering that I've been having a day with these recordings and my speech abilities, are that sclerophyllous plants have a few things in common. So they all have hard leaves with large quantities of fibrous or woody tissues. They're all long-lived leaves, so that just means they have fewer new cell requirements, which is a way of preserving resources. They all have low phosphorus needs. So again, you'll remember in the other lecture, I went on about how little phosphorus there is in Australian soils. So sclerophyllus plants are adapted to this. Most of them use internal recycling of nutrients, so they can withdraw nutrients from their leaves and withdraw nutrients from their branches before they drop leaves or branches. So again, that's another way of, making the most of the nutrients because there's not a lot in the soil. Eucalypts and Banksias are particularly good at mobiling their nutrients, so they can recycle nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which again, hopefully you remember, they're the important nutrients for plants. All sclerophyllus plants grow pretty slowly in nutrient deficit conditions. Some species have those important symbiotic relationships with bacteria and fungi to enhance nutrient availability. So again, this is going back to the previous lecture on plant communication and those important mycorrhizal relationships. Sclerophyllus forests can come in two types, wet and dry. Now, before the end of this lecture, I am determined to start saying sclerophyllus without pausing every time I say it. Oh man, I've been hearing that word for 15 years and I still can't do it. So wet Oh my god. Okay. Wet sclerophyllus forests. They cover a really small amount of Australia at the moment, so only 0.75% of Australia's land cover consists of these wet sclerophyllus forests. But they're really important to biodiversity and to conservation. So these forests are characterised by trees taller than 30 metres and greater than 1,000 millimetres of annual rainfall. So if you'll recall in lecture 1, I said that 80% of Australia gets really small amounts of rainfall. So that's a determining factor as to why there's such small amounts of wet sclerophyll forests here. But like I said, they are really important. They're associated with quite a few threatened native species, such as the powerful owl, the northern bettong, yellow-bellied glider, and the Hastings river mouse. So there are some really key Australian species that take refuge in these areas, and that makes wet sclerophyll forests important in our landscape. We've covered wet sclerophyll forests somewhat briefly, but because they cover relatively less area than dry sclerophyll forests. So next we're going to delve a little bit more closely into dry sclerophyll forests. But I encourage you at this point to maybe take a break, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and come back to watch the second half of this lecture. It's a little bit longer than the other lectures, so please feel free to pause and reset, re-energize, and come back for some more fun, hopefully. So, welcome back. Cheers. We are now talking about dry sclerophyll forests. So dry sclerophyll forests are those environments that you think of when, we really imagine the Australian bush. Tall, open eucalypts, a shrubby, spiky understory. In fact, the word bush actually comes from the Dutch bos, which was used to describe the natural country of South Africa. And if you think about those two elements, South Africa and Australia being shared in Gondwana land, the environments share a lot of similarities. So dry sclerophyll forests are much more widespread than wet sclerophyll forests. In fact, 1/4 of the vegetation classes mapped in New South Wales are types of dry sclerophyll forests. So this just reflects how variable these plants are in their topography, their geology and climate, and the geographic range within these forests. They're taking up a lot of niches. Come with me on a walk through a sclerophyll environment. I want you to notice how much sunlight there is. There's so much sun still hitting the ground. It's an open canopy. The trees are tall and extremely old. The understory is shrubby and bushy and spiky. It's so well adapted to even less rainfall than up there in the canopy. So what you're hopefully noticing in that last video and this one are that eucalyptus are the dominant tree species in sclerophyll forests. Now, eucalyptus have been called nature's boarding houses because they provide excellent and absolutely essential habitats for arboreal mammals and birds. Now, arboreal just means you live in the trees, but the essential thing that eucalyptus provide are tree hollows. Long before a tree dies, it starts to decay. So fungi get into the internal wood structure and eat away at it, and this creates hollows inside the branches and the trunk. Now, when a eucalyptus reaches maturity, so over 30 meters, and that takes quite a few years, strong winds can sometimes knock these branches down, and what it leaves behind is an hollow open to the rest of the world. And a massive portion of Australian birds and mammals absolutely need these hollows to nest in and to reproduce and survive. When it comes to the understory, as I mentioned briefly in the video before, they're dealing with even tougher conditions than the eucalypts. So dry sclerophyll eucalypts let the sunlight through, which means that shrubs and grasses can absolutely grow there. But the environment that these plants are growing in is even drier than the tree layer because less rainfall comes through as the eucalyptus canopy catches it all. Yeah? And so these plants have to be even better adapted at coping with dry soil. So things like, leaves protected against water loss. So the sorts of things that we've talked about hard leaves, really woody, fibrous tissues, particularly small leaves and spiky leaves are really characteristic of they're usually acacias and banksias that grow in the understory of these areas. They can also use root systems to try and tap the groundwater, and they can use small stem clasping leaves. They can even have systems that try and funnel water to their roots using their leaf and their branch shape. And some of them can even have capacity to store water in their tissues. So all of these things make them well adapted at living in a particularly dry environment. Like all rich and sustaining habitats, sclerophyll forests contain food, water, shelter, and specialised space for a multitude of species to live out a fulfilling social and reproductive life. They're multi-storied habitats, from the floor litter to logs to the grassy understory and tree structure that dominates the canopy. They're really well adapted to the Australian environment. They have specialised systems to deal with low rainfall and low nutrients. They are even adapted to fire. So bushfire can actually play a vital role in the regeneration of dry sclerophyll forests. Many species of dry sclerophyll plants are able to re-sprout from buds protected beneath the soils or within the trunk or branches of the plant. Now, we'll talk more about this when we talk about fires later in the semester. But the point I want to reiterate here is even though they are fire adapted, they are adapted to a natural fire regime, which in the case of dry sclerophyll forests means they're adapted to having catastrophic fires about once in every 100 years. Sclerophyll forests are uniquely adapted to the Australian environment and once covered huge expanses of Australia. However, they don't persist in the same sorts of numbers. Even though sclerophyll forests grow on nutrient-poor soils, which means that actually compared to a lot of habitats, they've fared very well, we still are missing around 50% of the original trees and forest ecosystems that were here in 1750. So that is before Europeans arrived in Australia. This map shows the extent of deforestation and clearing that is undertaken for sclerophyll forests. So, as I said, around half has been cleared, and that's mostly for agricultural purposes. In the yellow is currently where sclerophyll forests, both wet and dry, remain, and the blue is the estimated range in 1750. So especially around New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria, there's been heavy clearing for agricultural purposes. Human habitat destruction, increasing fire frequency and intensity also have the capacity to even further destroy these areas. And if they don't destroy them, they could also really simplify these ecosystems. And so that means all these species that rely on them, are under threat. Even in areas that are currently protected, which for sclerophyll forests is under 20% of all the forests are in reserves right now, even these areas are subject to the impacts of climate change. In a 2017 report by the CSIRO, which looked at impacts of climate change on sclerophyll forests, they estimated that we could lose up to a further 50% of our eucalypt forests because of changes in temperature, rainfall, soil moisture, and changes in the fire regimes brought about by climate change. This represents a real threat to a valuable ecosystem, which is uniquely Australian and quantifies part of our national identity. CSIRO, as well as the Department of Environment and Energy, have put together some management strategies that are aimed to protect our sclerophyll forests. So these include suggestions such as reservation of continuous transects of sclerophyll forest from coast into the eastern slopes of the Great Dividing Range. This allows plants to move on environmental gradients under the stress of climate change. So if a different area becomes more favourable in the future, plants are able to move to those areas instead of being locked off by road or urban areas. They also recommend restricting fragmentation and improving connectivity. So again, this points to reserving large remnants, stopping patches from being isolated, and ensuring that there's wildlife corridors for not only the movement of animals, but also the movement of plants. The reports suggest that we need tourist and visitor management to ensure that humans aren't damaging these spaces, and feral animal control. Now, fortunately, CSIRO actually acknowledged in the report that most of these management strategies are being strived for in at least some areas of Australia. CSIRO did report, however, that fire regime management might need some extra attention and support. So I actually quote from their article that they said that additional resources may need to be devoted to fire detection and suppression in conservation areas to mitigate undesirable outcomes. Now, this paper was published in 2012, so these suggestions have been out there for a while. It's 2020, and with the summer we've just had, I think it's fair to say that maybe some of this advice still needs to be taken on board. Sclerophyll forests are important to us all, not only for biodiversity, but they are at the very core of our national identity. They are the Australian bush. They're home to multiple species of native plants, and they provide important structures to our native animals. These forests, while perhaps somewhat more resilient to the impacts of climate change than other biomes, are likely to still undergo substantial change by 2070. We need to help these places adapt to climate change, and that will require management interventions. Luckily, there is support for these, but we need more action at the local and national level if we are hope to save these amazing environments that are uniquely ours.